This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome into the Bartholomew Town Podcast. I'm Bill Bartholomew. On this episode, a conversation with Sal Monteiro and Keith Morton of the Nonviolence Institute. All right. Good morning, gentlemen. Obviously, we're waking up to a complex situation in the midst of a crisis that's been ongoing since really the beginning of Western civilization and probably before that, right? It's not a brand new situation that's played out, obviously, specifically in the last week with what's gone on in Minneapolis. That's highlighted once again the challenges that we face. Before we get into the discussion, if you could each introduce yourself, and we'll also note that PJ Fox was supposed to join us, but he's now on a call with the mayor and police commissioner, public safety commissioner Perry. So he will not be joining us right now. But Sal, I guess let's go around the round table here. Introduce yourself, explain the work you've done, and then we'll get into the teeth of the discussion for today.
Hey, thanks, Bill. Thank you for having me here on this podcast. I'm Sal Monteiro. I'm the Senior Nonviolence Facilitator at the Nonviolence Institute here in Providence, Rhode Island. I've been working at the Institute for about 15 years, but I've been studying and practicing nonviolence for over 25 years. Again, just thank you for having us and having this discussion.
Absolutely. All right, Keith.
Yeah, Keith Morton. I'm a board member of the Nonviolence Institute and have been an ally and colleague of Sal's for a number of years, most of the 15 years that he's talking about. And I also teach at Providence College in the Public and Community Service Studies Department. And the intersection of those is that I've done a lot of work with youth in Providence who are involved in different kinds of violence in the streets that the Institute's interested in.
All right. So obviously, as I alluded to, complex situation. Just yesterday, Governor Raimondo put out a statement that specifically hyper-focused here in Rhode Island and Providence, that the protest, the rally that occurred on Saturday, despite some media reports that had sort of said, all right, this was an act, there were lots of acts of vandalism or was somehow chaotic. The reality was I was on the ground there all day. It certainly was a peaceful and effective rally. 2,000 people gathered. There were a few folks that spray painted on the State House steps. The governor doubled down on that notion that it was in fact a productive and peaceful rally. We wake up this morning to the news that overnight, and many people experienced overnight, significant amount of people, 65 people arrested. I was downtown. I smelled gasoline, smelled like there were some kind of Molotov cocktails. And it just seems like last night there was a riot that, although elements of the cause may have been present, it seems like it had been usurped by other forces, so to speak. So I guess let's sort of touch on, if we can start with Sal, what do you make of the last week in the United States and how it's played out in different ways over the last few days here in Rhode Island?
Well, Bill, first off, part of my job is to train organizations in nonviolence. So I've had the opportunity to travel to many different cities, such as Chicago, Baltimore, Selma, Alabama, Salinas, California, Connecticut, Detroit, Michigan, Belfast, Ireland. And I've worked with those police forces in each of those cities. And I can say that Providence does not have half of the issues that these cities have. The relationship that Providence police have with Providence, with the Institute, with the community, is far beyond, way past the curb. So when I see what happened last night, first off, from what the information that I'm receiving from the people that were there, people from the Institute that were there, a lot of those people were from out of state. They weren't actually Providence youth and people. It hurts. It bothers me that it's come to this, but I don't think I just, there's a lot to it. It's years and generations of not being heard. It's anger. It's the voiceless, as Martin Luther King says, it's the voice of the people that not being heard. So it is heard because I love Providence, and I think Providence is one of the best cities our relationship with the police. This wasn't called for. This was something else, I think. This had nothing to do with the message of George Floyd. I think this was just almost like a bandwagon type thing. Like, hey, everybody else is doing it, so let us do it, right? So I don't think it was really, the intent was genuine.
Keith, on that note, before we began taping, we were sort of discussing how complex something like this is, because obviously on the one hand, anybody who is paying attention to reality knows that we live in a world of stratospheres and in injustice. It's played out in education. It's played out in healthcare. Obviously, the COVID crisis has highlighted that. Everything from drinking water to police relationships with certain communities. The list goes on and on. So that frustration pents up. As someone who describes yourself as an ally looking in, what do you make of the past week or so, and particularly the various events that have occurred here in Rhode Island and the response to those events?
Right. Well, I think as Sal's pointing out, and we were talking a little bit about this, Bill, but one of the complexities is that there's not a single voice anywhere around the circle on this. There's a lot of different interests and voices. And the challenge is always sorting out whose voice really needs to be listened to and who can be brought into a constructive dialogue in one way or another. And the other thing I've been thinking a lot about, this is often really complicated for people to appreciate, but there's a long history of the kind of violence that led to George Floyd's death, his murder. But his particular death has blown up into a national event that is getting international attention now, and not everyone does. And I think part of the reason is that he was killed by a police officer. And what that does is the cultural historian Rene Girard talks about the doubling effect of that kind of violence. And what he means by that is that it's not only that Mr. Floyd was killed, but that the moral authority of the state was called into question because this cop acted way outside of the bounds of what would be considered legitimate violence. And the state has a lot of its authority because it is allowed to use legitimate violence. And if somebody representing it steps out of that, it calls into question the moral authority of the entire state and civil society generally. And so I think part of the reason what King was getting at when he said a riot is the language of the unheard is that it's people responding to an incident like this and saying that we deal with a kind of structural violence that's the equivalent of this murder every single day. And, it does matter that George Floyd was murdered. I hope there's some justice around that. But if you really want to remedy this, listen to what we're trying to tell you through this really rough, coarse language of violence and riot. And so civil authorities like the mayor or the chief of police in a city like Providence, the safety commissioner, what they have then is a couple of choices responding to the riot of last night or to the protest of a few days ago. And that is, are we going to step into it in a way that we can listen and be part of a conversation with you that starts to get at remedies that might be available? Or we actually have a president right now who's advocating the use of domination and force. And as soon as you do that, it just multiplies exponentially. And there's never enough to keep it contained ultimately, right? So very limited options, but I think that's really where we're coming to locally and nationally.
No question. And, you mentioned the president and that sort of use of dominating force, which from my perspective only widens the gap and only furthers the timeline that we're going to spend in this quagmire of inequity. And to his credit, Mayor Lorza this morning, he was very quick, as if he had made the decision already when Steve Klamkin of WPRO asked him, would you accept National Guard or military forces patrolling downtown Providence. The mayor said immediately, no, that's not part of his toolkit, and that he's going to basically rely on what you referenced, Sal, which is the community police relationship that is growing, that has been because of the Community Safety Act and other factors, Chief Clements and so on and so forth. There is a pathway that can be forged. Sal, if you can just discuss your perspective on the relationship, go into a little more detail on the relationship between Providence police and Providence residents, and how can that be leveraged now to try to make sure that the real voices that need to be heard are heard and are not drowned out by potential outside actors that are looking to usurp this moment and this movement?
Well, it's been hard work. It's been building relationships. It's doing trainings. The Institute actually, we had the chief of police on our board. We have Major Oscar Perez on our board. So the fact that they are involved in nonviolence, they're involved in community meetings, they're involved in building relationships with the community has helped us. But it hasn't been easy, right? It's been taking years. The Institute's been around since 2000, and here we are 20 years later, and we're still working towards that. But it comes with the courage of the community, willing to hear the officers. It comes from the courage of the officers willing to hear the community and to understand that we're all in this together. It comes from working with people like Keith, that's always in the community, that had a rec program that involved a lot of kids that were involved in police incidents, and having a space where police can come and engage with the youth. So those are the small things that we do as a community that strengthens our relationship with the police. It comes from strong leadership in the police force, and it comes from strong leadership from our community. Think about all the work other people in our community have done, such as Kobe Dennis. He did a lot of work with building relationships between the community and the police. So it's been a accumulation of a bunch of people, as Keith said, that are courageous enough to put their voice forward, and the police having the courage enough to listen to us. And that comes from strong leadership, that comes from understanding, that comes from compassion for the community, your job. And I think that is what has helped us navigate through a lot of this, which is like, we don't have police. You don't read about police killing people in Providence. And I think, like I said, and I'm the most anti-police person in the world. Keith can tell you this. I am against police, that entity of police force, that idea of having a police force. I'm totally against that. But I'm very proud of the fact that the police force that we do have here in Providence operates in the way that it does.
Keith, if you could sort of touch on, there is, of course, there's two ways to look at where we're at right now. I mean, I guess there's probably unlimited ways, but two ways that jump out to me are, okay, we've got a situation that fundamentally is based on a lack of trust with not just the police, but broadly the state. And that lack of trust has been earned. I mean, let's face it, over just basic tier 1 level history and assessment, critical assessment indicates as such. At the same time, in order to move forward, unless we were to restart society from the ground up, you know what I mean? Like a day one type of situation where we rebuild society without a police force or whatever it may be, there's got to be a compromise and a solution. So you almost get into a dog chasing its own tail type of situation here. Where do we separate the two conflicting narratives where, on the one hand, we need to have a dynamic between communities and states, and I mean that in the lowercase states, or nations or whatever you want to call it, I guess some kind of enforcement to prevent chaos. But at the same time, we need to keep that power checked in a way that it benefits those who the state represents. How do we get there now?
Well, I think you're also asking a question that I think ultimately goes back to how do we imagine what democracy is? And if we see the citizens as the real engine of democracy, then I think that distinction between the state and the community is kind of a false distinction, right? And so I think the best place to begin is looking for the strengths and experiments and assets of different communities, particularly those that have been hurt the most. In Minneapolis, for example, there's a neighborhood in Powderhorn Park, which is close by South Minneapolis, and they've had meetings with 200, 300 people showing up, and they're using what they call a village concept. How do we collectively protect our village? And they're the people showing up at the riots and locking arms to protect a police officer from getting beat down, to protect somebody's business from being burned down, and opening up space for dialogue among all these different actors in the community. And it's Powderhorn Park has been working on this. It's also home to one of the largest urban Native American communities in the United States, and there's a long legacy of violence there. And they've been working on that for at least 30, 40 years now. But they've got this amazing resource to share. So I think what I think really it is looking at the structural systems that we've got that prevent those positive experiments from being able to expand into something more broadly. So how do poor communities of color get access to capital? How do they get access to high quality education? How would they have some control over the kind of building and housing that is in the community and available to people and made and affordable? So just simple things like that at a really big level, big scale. And then thinking about how do you create more and more conversation, listening, dialogue, and turn over some real authority to these local community voices. And there's a lot of experiments around that, including in Providence that are going on. Sal mentioned Kobe Dennis. Kobe now works for the YMCA. And his role there in part is to broker a lot of these relationships and conversations. But there's, a dozen, 15 other major initiatives like that you can look at just here in a really tiny state. So I think I get where your question's coming from, because it's often posed as this kind of oppositional binary, but I don't think that's really how it plays out.
Fascinating, Sal. And by the way, that with your explanation, I completely agree with that notion as well, that it is not a binary, the duality of, look, it goes out to things like liberal, conservative. I mean, we see people tweeting out on, somehow trying to conflate this as this is a Democrat, Republican, progressive, conservative sort of issue. I mean, this is a humanity issue. There's nothing about this that's political at all until it's politicized by certain individuals. Sal, if we could just kind of get into your own firsthand perspective, where do we begin? Obviously conversations, because you ask political leaders, and you ask community leaders to get involved. We and create equity councils when it comes to COVID-19. We have the Community Safety Act and the various groups that are around that. You mentioned Kobe Dennis. We see the work of PRISM. We see the work of Amor. There are many people who are devoted 100% to this issue. But at the same time, what's the big moment? What would it take to get someone right now who might be listening in, I don't know, Ashaway, that has no experience on the ground, with this sort of violence or this sort of systemic inequity, someone in South County that potentially just doesn't have any perspective? How do we get the bulk of the nation, at least the bulk of the state, on board with the idea that these injustices are what are fundamentally perpetuating, whether it's protests, violence, whatever it may be? How do we get everyone on board with that notion so that we can start there?
Well, I think we've already started. The work has been put in, right? This is not something that just started, last month or with just COVID-19. Building relationships, talking about injustices and racism in our society. It's been started. We've been doing this for years. It's about continuing the work. And how do we spread that word? It's I was there Saturday downtown with, and to me it felt like there was a lot more white people down there than there was black people. But that's another way to stop. All those white people that were down there, if they want to keep this movement going, if they want to sustain it, if they want to keep this message going, they have to go back into their communities, to their jobs, their families, their friends, and their network, and have that same energy, have that same courage to be down there. And, Black lives even matter every day, not just on that Saturday, right? So they need to go back into their communities and their families and their networks. The people that don't have the same mindset as them, and have those conversations, continue to have those conversations, continue to make change in their circle. And that's how you sustain a movement. That's how you continue this, is by spreading the word, by having this podcast right now so that people on Facebook can tune in, by you continuing doing the work, Keith continuing to do his work at the Providence College. So it's happening. And I don't know what the big moment looks like. Maybe it's not a big moment. Maybe it's just a transition. But the work has always been there. When we're no longer here, the work will continue. And it's a lifelong process. Right? So I don't think there is any we made it, or there's, crossed the tape and at the finish line and we made it. It's a part of life. So I think just continuing to do what we've been doing, maybe be a little bit louder, a little bit more aggressive, non-violently aggressive, and forcing them, listen, this is what it is. We're not going to stop. We're going to be in your face until we seek some sort of equality to this, right? Martin Luther King says, until there will be days of unrest, there will not be tranquility until America comes face to face with this issue. And whatever that looks like is what you're seeing now. We have to remember that during the nonviolence movement was violent. There was violence in the nonviolent movement. Just because we said it was nonviolent, there were people that practiced nonviolence and used nonviolence. But Martin Luther King also realized that, he said to people, hey, this is a nonviolent movement. If you can't be nonviolent, then we're going to have to find something else for you to do, right? Because this is a nonviolent movement. And we have to corral those type of people. We have to get those people involved. We have to put those people into front lines because all week, and this is maybe switching, but all week since this all started, people have been asking me, why is there rioting? Why is there looting? Why are people destroying their community? And it took me a while to really try to figure out why. And maybe this is not the right answer, but to me, there is an essence to rioting and looting. And that essence is, basically, I'm tearing down this belief that businesses, power, ownership, that I'm less than, that if I don't have this money or if I don't own this, I'm worthless. That, why do I have to walk into a store in a poor community and pay $5 for milk? Not against any other race or culture, but in poor communities, why is it that other cultures can come into my community, set up businesses, make money, and I'm struggling? It's almost like tearing down it's almost like ripping up the Constitution and the amendments, because we weren't involved in that. We weren't considered in that. So I want to burn this stuff. I want to burn it to the ground and start all over again. And there's an essence to that, whether that makes sense or not. But I know for people of color and oppressed people, there's a feeling towards that. Like, you didn't include me in building this country, so I'm going to tear it down. Rioting, looting has always been a part of this culture since the colonial days, since Paul Revere, since, Gatsby Day that we celebrate every year. Fire has always been a part of an uprising. So there is an essence behind this also, whether it makes sense or not. I wish it wasn't, but there's some type of meaning behind the rioting and looting. It's not just, let's just go. Why don't they riot, loot, and go down and burn people's houses? They don't go into neighborhoods and take people out of their houses and burn the houses down, but they do it in businesses. They do it in certain areas. I don't know, Keith, does that make sense to you? I mean, to me, that's my own personal thought of why, one of the reasons why people decide to riot and loot. Sorry.
I think that's what King was getting at. If riot is the language of the unheard, that's what they're trying to say in part. I've been thinking a lot too. One of my mentors, I was fortunate earlier in my life, was a guy named Herman Blake, who ended up as a college president, but he had also been a member of the Black Panthers when he was a young man. And he was out on the West Coast in one of the big cities, and his job was not being out there with a gun saying, by any means necessary, which made the Panthers famous. But he was organizing social services in his community, primarily around education. And the moral authority that the Black Panthers had in the Black community was on the basis of their care and service to this larger community, right? So I think that's equally a really, really big part of it. And the thing I keep coming back to, I'm teaching a course right now, a graduate course in education. And, we're looking at disparities in education in Rhode Island, in Providence particularly, with Johns Hopkins report.
Come on, right?
So where does that come from? Like, what do we do with that? And how can that even be remotely acceptable? And there's nobody involved in education who is setting out to make it fail for children. Everybody wants it to work, and it doesn't work anyway. So what it suggests to me is that there's something really deeply structural that needs to be discovered and addressed and fixed. And I think, unfortunately, in the United States, and this is to Sal's point, that what it is we're really starting to try to get it to the root of is this sort of deeply baked in racism that has been part of the country since its founding. And it's expressed through a whole series, the accumulation of hundreds of years of policy choices and laws, as well as social and cultural relationships. And that dependably produces these results that nobody wants. And that a lot of whites, not everybody certainly, but a lot of whites want sort of to restore social order. And the message over and over again is that social order is not working for everybody.
Bingo. Yeah. That's the fundamental message right there, Keith. And Sal, I would assume you would agree that, the fundamental order of society is broken. It's been broken. We can go back to the fairy tale of 1492 and Columbus and all of that. You can look at history even before that and some of the conquests that occurred. You go to Newport and walk around there. You can feel it in the air that those early conquests are still permeating. And the way that we've legislated our society has been based on inequity. I mean, whatever it may be, the GI Bills after World War II, the idea that after following the Emancipation Proclamation, the former slaves were by and large not given anything from which to build upon, while others in the Midwest were given plots of land to build farms and develop society from that standpoint. You can work your way back through history. And I'm always struck by the ignorance. And I want to give each of you the last word here as we wrap up. But the last thing I'll say is I'm always struck by the ignorance of folks who would, neglect that history. And, we can get into the whole white privilege discussion and all that, which is obviously true and obviously fundamental.
Bill, before we get the last word, can I say something real quick?
You got it.
And this is something that me and Keith, like I say, I respect Keith so much. He's one of my mentors, my brother, my role model. But me and Keith had this conversation a while back, and I'm pretty sure he remembers. When we talk about privilege and the history, if you think about white privilege in this country, if you have to come to terms with that, right, as a white person, you have to realize that you have to look at yourself in the mirror and say, what did I really earn? What did I really work hard for? If I don't acknowledge my white privilege, and if I acknowledge my white privilege, it means I have to realize that I had it easy in this world. My life could be hard. Bill, your life could be hard. Keith, your life could be hard. We both could come from, poor families. We both could suffer a lot of different ills, right? We both could be broke and homeless. But your life is not hard because you are white. Your color is an asset towards you. So when you look at the history of, people acknowledging white privilege, that means you have to look in the mirror and say, damn, well, did I really earn this? Did I really work hard for this? Did I really deserve this? Or did I just get this because my skin is white and I've had a past my whole life? And I'm not really all that I think I am as compared to other people of color. And that is a hard pill to swallow when you have to realize that, come this far, you're in this position, you make this a lot of money, you got this house, and you have to ask yourself, well, did I really earn this? Did I really work hard for this, or was this given to me on a pass?
The game is rigged, and anyone who thinks otherwise isn't paying attention, and it's just, and again, that doesn't make you a fundamentally evil person because you're in that position. But boy, does it suggest that you should reevaluate everything that you understand about the world and have that lens. And look, I grew up in Southern Rhode Island, and it took me a long time, even having a family with a multiracial family, and growing up close to the Narragansett headquarters and being exposed to that world at a very young age. It took me a very long time, probably not until I left Rhode Island and I moved to Brooklyn, where I spent a decade, before I really started to say, I got it. So on the one hand, I can understand why someone, in Southern Rhode Island or Northern Rhode Island or whatever, that is kind of lived in a bubble, doesn't see the world for what it is. But it's the same at the same time. It's that person's responsibility to wake up. And again, that doesn't make you fundamentally evil, but it means that you have an element of ignorance that is leading to what we see today. Why is the Providence Place Mall been breached? Partially because there's some people who, like you say, they kind of got with the momentum of, all right, let's just rip things apart. But by and large, the root cause of everything that we've seen, that's not going to be suppressed by military forces. That might for a day or for a month or for a period, but it's going to be suppressed by people waking up themselves and looking at the world through an honest lens. I know we're going way over, so Keith, if you just can kind of give your final statement here on this, and then we'll wrap it up with Sal. And first of all, I just want to say that you are each heroes of mine and incredible leaders in this community. And I look up to both of you, and I'm really, really excited that we were able to talk today. So we'll start with Keith on the way out here.
Well, thank you for the good word, Bill. I think I just like the title of one of King's collections of essays as a way to wrap it up. He said the choice is chaos or community. I think that's pretty good summary.
Yep. Yeah. Sal?
Yeah, I thank you again for this. Again, this is just another part of bringing about the change that we need in society. So I again thank you, Bill. And I would just say, we gotta keep the fight going. We gotta keep fighting. We gotta keep believing. We got to keep our spirits up. We got to keep our heads up, and we still got to keep our distance. COVID-19 is still out there.
Get that mask out, right?
Yeah. Right. But I think, this is a part of it. This is a part of it. There's, like I said, people have been fighting this fight for hundreds of years before us, and as long as we're alive and live in a society, we're going to be fighting this for another 100 years. But we have to continue.
This is the Bartholomew Town Podcast.
At HealthSource RI for Employers, we provide access to health insurance to more than 1,100 local businesses and nonprofits, and 96% of them renew through us every year. Maybe it's our choice of 19 different health plans, our 10 years of customizing solutions, or our one local team of dedicated experts helping employers find quality health insurance. See how our numbers stack up for you. Learn more at healthsourceri.com/employers.